All right, I'm recording. I think we're ready to go. Today will probably be a short lecture. That's me just trying to be a little bit fair. I recorded, if you're doing the last optional homework assignment, I went ahead and recorded much of the material that we would have covered today. I recorded and posted that over the weekend to give you a head start on the assignment if you want to go ahead and look at that. If you're watching the regular lectures, be sure you don't skip that one. A lot of the material we would have normally covered is in the extra lecture that I posted yesterday. It's between lecture 23 and what we're recording today, which will be lecture 24. So if you're watching this recorded, I would go back and watch that other lecture first. I think it'll make, we'll skip over some of that today. And then when we get to the stuff at the end, it'll probably be easier to follow if you've already watched that recorded lecture. If you're here live, you should be fine either way. But if you do have the option of watching that other one first, then I would suggest doing that. All right, so we finished up last time talking about protection, which is mostly about mechanisms to deal with internal things on a system. And when I say things, I mean processes. Protection mechanisms let us say what processes can and can't do. And then we expect the operating system to enforce the things that we said, even if we're not looking over its shoulder. Security is more about protecting against external threats, protecting against flaws in your system or people that are willing to attack it from ways other than just running a well-behaved process that tries to follow the rules, or where the OS can, in principle, force it to follow the rules. So an obvious comparison would be, if you're worried about protection mechanisms, you can say what processes can and can't read particular files. And if you do that right, you can be assured that processes won't be able to access files that they shouldn't. But an external attacker could potentially walk up to your computer system, pick it up, carry it out the door, and then access your files from another system, no matter how many protection mechanisms you've put in place. So security, I normally think of protection as something that you can do perfectly. You can say exactly what every process ought to be able to do, but there's kind of no end to what you might have to worry about with security. There's always going to be new ways people could try to attack a system. There might always be new ways that they could uncover information that, that you didn't plan or you didn't want them to be able to uncover. When we're talking about security, we normally think about what ways people could gain unauthorized access to a system and an attempt to do that. An attempt by a user or one of those users' processes to get something they shouldn't, we'll call that an attack. And broadly, there are 5 kinds of attacks that we might be concerned about. Some of them may be more severe categories than others. I've listed them here and I'll try and go through the definitions of these quickly. They're not necessarily ordered by severity, but a breach of confidentiality is when a process or a user or something gets access to data that they shouldn't have. I think comparing these kinds of attacks to financial institutions makes a lot of sense. If I was thinking about a computing system at my bank, I would like maybe my bank account balance to be secret. And if someone could sneak in and find out what my balance is or what everyone's balance is, we would call that a breach of confidentiality. A breach of integrity is when an attacker can modify data in a way that violates the rules of the system. If you think of the rules of the system as preserving the integrity of the data, a breach of integrity violates that. It's a way of modifying data in a way that an attacker shouldn't be able to. And I think a bank analogy helps with this too. If I was able to sneak into my banking system and suddenly make an extra $1,000 appear in my bank account out of nowhere, I've kind of violated the integrity of the data stored in that system without following the rules. So being able to go in and kind of selectively change data would be a breach of integrity. A breach of availability is when you can, maybe you can't know about secret data, maybe you can't selectively change secret data, but maybe you could make it unavailable to legitimate users. For instance, if all of the account balances were saved in a big file, You probably wouldn't do that, but if they were, if you could go in and delete that file, even if you couldn't see what was in it, and even if you couldn't change it selectively, deleting it would be destroying the data. It would be making it unavailable to legitimate users. So breach of availability would typically include things like unauthorized destruction of data. Theft of service is when you can use a computer system or really any computing device, any other part of the hardware, for some purpose that it wasn't intended. A simple, maybe fairly benign example of this would be if you could send print jobs to a printer you weren't supposed to use, or if you could run some kind of server on a computing system that you didn't own. I guess we've got a readily available example of here in mining Bitcoins. If you could run a process that was mining Bitcoins on a computer system that you didn't own and you weren't supposed to be running compute-intensive processes like that on it, we'd call that a theft of service. And maybe even if you can't do any of those things, even if you can't compromise the data or change it selectively, if you could keep other legitimate users from being able to access that data, from being able to use that computer system, we'd call that a denial of service attack. Typically, if I can force a computer system to crash, or if, I guess, a typical type of attack like this is just flooding it with so many illegitimate requests that it can't keep up with legitimate requests fast enough, that would keep, even if I couldn't use it myself, I could keep legitimate users from being able to use those systems. So here I've listed it's kind of your book's standard definition of types of attacks, or of sort of categories of attacks. A lot of these attacks show up in the form of bad programs. And when I say bad programs, I mean ones that have either deliberately malicious code in them, so programs that are bad on purpose, and programs that might be bad by accident. And I've listed some typical attacks that might be hidden inside a program, and I color-coded them based on what I just said. So the first three I colored in, I'm gonna say blue. Those are attacks that are typically there on purpose. They're hidden inside a program, and they're made to introduce an exploit into a system. And then the next two I colored in red. Those are kind of the result of accidentally bad programs. I want to talk through these, but to make it more fun to talk through some of them, I wrote an example. I wrote one of those deliberately bad programs, and it's called backdoor.c. And no surprise, it's supposed to exhibit that backdoor attack that was listed on the slide, but this is the first time we talked about it. A backdoor is a deliberately malicious piece of code that is left inside an otherwise legitimate service. Like if I was writing a server, like one of those TCP servers that we wrote on homework assignment 5, but I deliberately put in some code that I could use to gain access to any system that's running this server. So let's say a company hires me to write a couple of servers for them, and I hide some code in that server with a plan that even when I'm not working for that company, or when I'm not, if I don't have the same permissions as the server I'm going to write, maybe that hidden code would let me gain access to data that I shouldn't have, even if the code I wrote should have access to that. And that's what I hid inside this program. This program, let's go ahead and run it. I've got it compiled. Backdoor. What does it do? It opens a server socket, it listens on a particular port, and I can go down here and connect to it from this window at the bottom. I'm going to use that same command that you used in homework 5, nc, because it's a really easy way to just type text to this program and then print out whatever it sends back. So localhost, and then the port number was, I think, 19919. Yeah, that looks good. So I connected to this. It sends me a string when I connect. That's typical of a lot of services. They'll tell you what service you've just connected to, and they might even tell you the version number of that service. So here, I wrote a program, and it claims to be David's super secret echo server. And sure enough, that's what it does. If you type a string like and then hit enter, it just echoes that string back to you. So hello world. it'll echo that back to you. And that's most of what it does. But like we'll see in the code in a moment, I didn't really hide it very well, but I put some malicious code in there. So if you know what to type, it won't just echo the result back to you, but it'll take whatever you type in and it'll execute it as if it was a shell command. You just have to know the password to type. And if I was really writing this as a backdoor into a system, I would do a better job hiding it, but I might need something like a password so that only I could exploit that backdoor. And my password is please. Any command that you put please in front of, instead of just echoing it back to you, it'll run it as a shell command. So if you say please ls, it will list what was in the directory. And you can't see the whole thing, but the end of that list got printed out here in my client. If I say please touch, you may remember touch from C and Software Tools class. All it does is, well, if a file doesn't exist, it'll create it. If a file does exist, it'll bring its modification time up to the present time. So I'm just going to use this to show that if I can run shell commands on this remote machine, I could change the files on the machine. So please touch David was here. Sorry, here. And so up here, this command got executed. Down here in the client, I'm just going to exit. And then I'm going to kill the server with Control-C. And then take a look. And sure enough, yeah, there's the file that I was able to make because this backdoor let me run arbitrary shell commands. I'll show you the code for that. Most of this program, we won't go through the whole thing, but it's mostly like what the examples we looked at in the networking material and what you did on homework 5. It's a TCP server written in C. Every time a client connects, it calls handle client, just like your code. Here's where I print out the welcome to my server message. When the program starts up, I read a password. So my password's configurable. You could change it by changing what's in this file. And if there is a password, whenever the user types in a command, I look at the first thing on that password. And if it's I look at the first word on that command they typed. And if it matches the password, I run it as a shell command in this sneaky function. Otherwise, I just echo it back to the user. And the rest of this is pretty much the same as any other TCP/IP server. Like I said, I didn't really hide the backdoor very well, especially because I put it in this function called sneaky function. But a clever programmer could do a better job hiding this. So this is an example of what you might do with a backdoor. I hid another vulnerability in this program, but this one's more like an accidental vulnerability. Let's take another look at the source code real fast. When I get a line of text typed by the user, I use this getLine function that I wrote. It'll read from any file you give it, and it'll store the line of text in the string. And the code for this function is right up here. You can see I just keep reading from the one character at a time from the file you told me to read. And as long as I haven't hit the end of line or haven't hit EOF, I just store it in the buffer. When I'm done, I put a null terminator at the end of the buffer, and then I return true or false based on whether I really got a line or not. But I don't do anything to check for buffer overflow here, which means an attacker could type in a really long string and they could buffer overflow this program. Now here, really long string would have to be string limit. I think if we look up at the top of the source code, I made that 1 kilobyte. So if I ran the server, and even though it has a backdoor in it, it has other vulnerabilities that I put in on purpose, but ones that might be typically made by accident. So here, this program is just waiting to buffer overflow. If I, again, logged into it, and if I was willing to type in 1,000 characters, I could overflow that buffer. That would take a moment, so I already wrote a program to do that for me. It's called Evil Client, and it connects to the server, and instead of having a user type in a sequence of characters, it just sends lots of data to the server, overflowing its buffer. Let's go ahead and run that Evil Client down here. I think, yeah, it also wants the host name of the server. So that's going to run at, it's running on the same system. So local host and the same port number we were using before. And when I hit enter on this, it's going to overflow the server's buffer and cause it to crash by really overwriting other data inside the server. Writing this in the form of an attacking program saved me a little bit of typing to crash the server, but more importantly, if I was going to hide this attack in a program, I could write a program that tried to be very clever about what it wrote into the server's memory. And if the server has a buffer overflow vulnerability, exploiting that vulnerability lets me write anything I want into, in this case, the stack memory for the server. And I could write more clever things than just code that forces it to crash or that overwrites its memory with garbage. I could write code that potentially injected other machine code into the server and then tried to trick the server into running that. So here I'm kind of trying to get a twofer in my examples. I tried to show off what a backdoor is. And I tried to show off this red one here, a stack or a buffer overflow. Backdoor is usually a deliberately malicious piece of code that's been put in a program, whereas stack or buffer overflows are usually accidental, but especially if you're coding in a language like C, they can be extremely common. Questions before we move on? I got to clean up the rest of these. A Trojan horse is, I used to demonstrate this with another deliberately bad example, but my example wasn't that good, so I'll just talk about it. A Trojan horse is kind of like a backdoor in that it's a program that contains a hidden attack inside of it. But instead of being installed in code that, that is going to run at a particular site, code that you put the attack in and you plan on it running at a particular organization. A Trojan horse is an attack that's hidden in a program that you intend to give away to a lot of potential users. I guess the most obvious example is if you had a game that you had written and you hid some malicious code inside that game, and then you gave that away to your friends or your enemies or anyone who was willing to download it. Then when they downloaded and ran that game, they would be executing the code that you wrote, including potentially malicious code. And if they're willing to do that, they're sort of giving you an opportunity to change files on their file system or do whatever you want when that untrusted code that you're running or that you put in there gets a chance to run. It's called a Trojan horse because it's kind of like an example of a game. It's something that you give away as if it's a prize, as if it's something good to get, like the Trojan horse, but it has a secret attack inside. A logic bomb is another example of a deliberately bad piece of code. Whereas a backdoor kind of had to wait for a particular user to try to access it, or someone who knows how to exploit the backdoor. A logic bomb just waits for a particular situation. The attack is not, doesn't depend on a particular user trying to exploit it. It just depends on particular circumstances. An example I think helps this make sense. If I got a chance to write a piece of server code that ran at the university, and it was going to run maybe with permissions higher than I normally have at the university, that would be a chance for me to put in some malicious code that waited for some event of interest for me. Like, I could write that code so that it looked at the list of university employees every day. And if my name ever disappeared from the list of employees, I could have that program launch an attack. Instead of waiting for me to do something, it's just waiting on a particular situation. That's the idea, that's the logic part of it. It's waiting for a particular condition to be met, like me being fired from the university, and then launching an attack as maybe in this example, a form of revenge when that happens. So we covered almost all of these. A timing attack, I colored that red, so that's an accidental vulnerability in a piece of code. You may have situations where the timing of the execution of a piece of code gives away information that should be secret. And maybe the easiest way to see or think about this is if you were authenticating yourself with a password. And let's say the code that checks your password uses the string comp operation from C. And you've probably never seen the code for the string comparison function, but you can imagine how it works. It just goes through the two strings that you ask it to compare, one character at a time. And as soon as it finds a character that doesn't match, it returns saying that they don't match. It returns with a negative value or a positive value for string comp, a non-zero value. If you knew that's how your password, or if you knew that's how someone else's password was going to get checked, you could use the timing of that string comp function to help you guess the password. For instance, if you type in a random password and it returns really fast, and then you type in another random password and it takes a little longer to return, now that means you've probably guessed some of the characters at the start of the password. If it took a little bit longer, that would mean, well, maybe the first character matched and it didn't fail until it went on to check the next character. And then you could keep guessing. I said random passwords just to make it easier to describe, but really you would probably do this systematically. You'd enter a password starting with an A, you'd enter a password starting with a B, and then a password starting with a C. And as soon as you found a letter that made it take a little bit longer to reject your password, then that might be an indication that you've gotten the first letter right. And you can move on to start guessing the next letter. Now, there we're talking about tiny differences in execution time, and it might be hard to measure those differences, but you could get around that by, instead of sending that guess of the password in just once, you could send it in 1,000,000 times, one after another, and then measure the total execution time. And then all the little differences in execution time would add up, and you could use that potentially to guess someone's password. And this has been exploited. It's harder to exploit today because, like we said in the previous lecture, the one I recorded over the weekend, we don't normally even store passwords in plain text. We store a hash of a password. This also shows that using string comp to guess plain text or to check plain text passwords is probably a bad idea. We got one more thing on this slide to talk about, and that's the idea of a virus. I colored it blue, so I would say that's a deliberately bad program. I feel silly trying to define the word virus because I take for granted everybody's familiar with that term, but if I had to define it, I would say a virus is a piece of code that includes an attack, potentially giving away secret data or executing a theft of service. But it doesn't just do that. It deliberately includes code to try to spread itself, as the name suggests. So it doesn't want to just compromise, or it's written so it doesn't just compromise one system, but once it's compromised that system, it tries to get copies of itself onto another system, often through physical media. Viruses, there are a lot of different types of viruses, or a lot of different ways of classifying viruses, but those are mostly based on a couple of things. If that virus is trying to copy itself to other systems, how does it do that? How does it copy itself? And for that virus to be effective, how does it hide itself? If you looked at the list of processes on your system and there was one named virus.exe, then you would probably start to wonder if you had a virus. So a capable virus doesn't do that. It tries to hide itself even when it's running on a system, maybe by looking like a legitimate program, or even by injecting its code into an otherwise legitimate program on a system. And if you look at your book's material on a virus, that's what it spends a lot of time talking about. How do viruses get copies of themselves onto other systems? And how do they hide themselves so that when they're running, you don't even know that they're there? All of these attacks on this page are attacks that would make sense even if your system wasn't on a network. These could be attacks that get distributed on physical media. These could be attacks on a system or based on a system that only serves users directly connected to that system. Once you put your system on a computer network, you kind of offer a lot more opportunities for attack. If you're running a computer system, like if you think of our remote EOS systems, they're running a lot of services for the benefit of their users. You can remotely log into them. So they're running a SSH server to let you remotely log in. You may have systems, a lot of systems that are running web servers or quote of the day servers. These are all examples that we talked about when we were talking about networking. All of those servers running on a system, all the services that it offers, each of those offers a potential for attack. If there's a vulnerability in any of those services on a system, that is something that an attacker could potentially exploit. So you'll hear the attack surface, or at least you'll hear the term attack surface used to describe all the different potential attacks available to a remote attacker. And that would include, like I said, every piece of software that's offering remote service, and every potential vulnerability, every potential buffer overflow, every potential bug in any one of those services. Not just the bugs, though. Any potentially misconfigured service. When you install a service, you get to pick things like maybe it has some passwords that you get to choose. Maybe it has some behaviors that you get to pick. And people make mistakes in choosing those things. And any of those mistakes in configuring a system, especially common mistakes, are something an attacker could exploit. Well, there are millions of systems out there on the internet. If I wanted to attack them, that could be a lot of work for me. I don't want to keep trying to log into random systems all over the world. So I'll write a program that does that. Typically, attacks on remote systems are automated. And if I know there are particular vulnerabilities that might be out there, either because of people running unpatched software, software with bugs in it, or undiscovered bugs so far, or potentially misconfigured code, I could write a piece of code that just went through millions of systems on the internet, looking for these vulnerabilities. And that's what a port scanning attack is. It's looking for systems with well-known vulnerabilities and really automating that search for well-known systems. If I can automate the detection of vulnerabilities, I could automate exploiting those vulnerabilities. And that's what a worm is designed to do. Instead of just finding systems that have well-known vulnerabilities, it goes ahead and exploits those systems to inject malicious code remotely on a system, even to inject code that continues the process of finding and exploiting vulnerabilities. I guess I'll go back to that last idea, or the previous idea. If I was launching attacks against millions of systems on the internet looking for vulnerabilities, then probably someone's going to come knocking at my door pretty soon because they figured out that all these attacks are coming from me. But if I can compromise some other systems that are out there, instead of launching the attacks from my system, I can launch attacks from other systems, potentially hiding my identity. And that's one of the main reasons for compromising other systems. It might not be because I want the data or I want to modify the data stored at those other systems. I just want to use them to launch other attacks, potentially hiding my own identity, or being able to launch more attacks even faster. And that's the idea of zombie systems that have been compromised and are now under the control of another user. And are used to launch attacks on behalf of that other user or organization. And we mentioned denial of service attacks a couple of slides ago. The idea that even if I can't compromise a particular system, maybe I could flood it with so much traffic that no legitimate user can use that. And if I've compromised hundreds or thousands of systems out there on the internet, I could use them to launch a denial of service attack where all of these compromised systems, all of these zombie systems participate. flooding it, potentially flooding it with so much traffic that it can't get any useful work done, or I guess flooding it with way more traffic than I could generate if I was just sending it from a handful of systems that I directly controlled. So looking back on these last two slides, what I've tried to do here is describe different types of attacks. Here, previous slide was all attacks based on bad programs, where you don't necessarily need a network to launch this kind of attack. And here, describing it based on attacks that are kind of enabled by a system being networking or being networked. We hit a point now when we can skip ahead a few slides, because if you go watch the lecture I recorded yesterday, we already talked about symmetric encryption and decryption. We talked about different things you can do with symmetric encryption and decryption with illustrations based on the My Little Pony cartoon. We talked about asymmetric encryption and decryption. We talked about how that works and some extra things you can do with that. We talked about a cryptographic hash as a kind of for us, a final encryption operation that doesn't depend on a key. We talked about a notation for describing cryptographic operations. And then we talked about a few different things that you could, different types of attacks and countermeasures based on the encryption technologies we already talked about. And we ended mostly talking about challenge response authentication and kind of the closely related idea, one-time use passwords. The idea that when I authenticate, I don't want to have to send the same string to a server every time I authenticate, because that is vulnerable to a replay attack. We got a couple of other things that we didn't cover because you don't necessarily need them for the next homework assignment. Let's finish those up real quickly. Even with these countermeasures, even with making sure that your authentication, that you've got a mechanism for authentication and maybe it's not subject to replay attacks, you could still be vulnerable to things like session hijacking. That's the idea that maybe someone successfully authenticates, and then once they've authenticated, you're willing to communicate with them and sort of trust their identity. But session hijacking is an attack where you can take over a session once someone else has already authenticated. Like if you had a TCP connection and someone authenticates over that TCP connection, there is a way to hijack, or at least there's an attack where that TCP connection can potentially be hijacked. And then you could trick a server into talking to you rather than the person who authenticated. So even if you didn't know their password, or even if you couldn't launch a replay attack, this would still let you interact with a server and get access to things that you shouldn't. A countermeasure, or I guess a related attack on this, would be a message modification attack. Even if I couldn't authenticate as a different user or a different system, if I could capture a message that a user had sent, and I could replay that message potentially with some changes, even if that message included authentication information in it, if I could go in and change what was in that message, I could potentially reuse that, even if I couldn't generate the authentication myself. I probably did a bad job of introducing this, but one way you could try to prevent a replay attack is you could include your password, or maybe a hash of your password, with every message you send. And that's what I'm trying to illustrate up here at the top of this slide. But if that's all you did, if someone could capture that message with the authentication information on it, and they could sneak in and change what was in that message, they could potentially use that to generate a message that looked like it was from you, but with different content to that message. An easy fix for this, or sorry, I've got one more thing before the easy fix for this. Even if they couldn't change the message. So a way to prevent this would be to encrypt messages that you send, so that an attacker, even if they could see the message that you sent, they couldn't modify it in any reasonable way, because all they see is an encrypted version of that message. But if that's all you did, you could still be vulnerable to a replay attack because some messages, sending out multiple copies of that message can have a useful effect for an attacker. That's a vague way of saying what I'm trying to show in this slide. If the message said something like, oh, sorry, I didn't introduce the participants for those of you who haven't seen the lecture that I recorded yesterday. So like I said earlier, I'm trying to illustrate some of these types of attacks using characters from My Little Pony. Because when I made these slides, that was a show of great interest to my younger daughter. So this character over here is Rainbow Dash. She's a good character. This character over here is Twilight Sparkle. She's also a good character. And this guy here is a dragon named Discord. And he's mostly, we'll say he's mostly a bad character. He's the one trying to eavesdrop on their communication or trying to modify their messages or something like that. So let's say Dash over here lost a bet to Discord. So she instructed Twilight Sparkle over here to give Discord $1. But they agreed they were going to encrypt their messages so Discord couldn't sneak in and modify them and retransmit a message. But if Discord could take that encrypted message and could just replay it, Discord could replay it not just once, but 1,000,000 times. And if all we did is notice, oh yeah, this is an authentic message, it's been encrypted by Rainbow Dash over here, sending that message 1,000,000 times could have the same effect as modifying the message. In this case, it could get this one message of give Discord $1. It could turn it into 1,000,000 requests to give Discord $1. An easy way to fix this is to make sure that you would never send the same message twice. When you send a message, instead of just encrypting it, it seems like you need to include something like sequence number information. This is the first request I've sent you. This is the second request I've sent you. And then sending the same request over and over. If that request contains sequence number information, then a receiver of that message would know that's just a copy of a previous message and could ignore it. Previously, when we talked about using asymmetric encryption, we talked about how it could be used to establish secrecy. Whenever you sent a message, you could encrypt it with the receiver's public key. That's something that you ought to be able to know, but only the receiver could decrypt that message. But doing that alone doesn't guarantee authenticity. When you get a message, you don't know who it came from. You can have authenticity kind of using the public key system backward. When Rainbow Dash sends out a message, if she encrypted it with her private key, then anyone could decrypt that. Since a message encrypted with Dash's private key only decrypts with Dash's public key. So encrypting with the receiver's public key generates an encrypted message that only the receiver can decrypt. Sending a message encrypted with the sender's private key generates a message that plausibly only that person could have sent, but anyone could decrypt it. So if we want secrecy and demonstration of authenticity, we can just do both. And that's what this picture at the bottom tries to show. If Dash wanted to send a message that clearly came from Dash, Rainbow Dash, and that only Twilight Sparkle could read, we could take that message M, we could encrypt it with Dash's private key. Anyone can undo that operation, but only Dash could have sent that message. Only Dash could have sent a message that was encrypted with a key that only she should know. But anyone could read that message, but we can fix that by taking the result, which should just be an array of bytes. Encryption works on any array of bytes, so we can take that result and encrypt it with Twilight's public key. And then only Twilight, if Twilight's doing a good job protecting her private key, then only she can decrypt that. And up here, I'm showing the same thing going the other way. So if we're willing to encrypt every message twice, we can use that to demonstrate both authenticity and to have secrecy in our communication. But it's going to be kind of expensive if we do that. Asymmetric crypto systems let us do a lot of neat things, but they tend to be computationally more expensive than symmetric crypto systems. We kind of saw evidence of this already. We looked at a key that we used in AES, and it was, 16 bytes long or so. We looked at a key that was used in RSA, and it was, I didn't check, but I would say it was a couple of 100 bytes long for that key. And that was just the public key. The private key was longer than that. And key length isn't the only thing that matters, but it's indicative of the overhead of the algorithms. Asymmetric crypto systems tend to be a lot more computationally expensive because they involve internal operations based on math. Symmetric crypto systems tend to be a lot cheaper. So it would be nice if we could have the advantages of an asymmetric system, at least in terms of the things we could do with it, but the performance advantages of a symmetric system. And in practice, we usually get that by only using asymmetric systems where we have to. If you want to communicate between two parties, well, we could have what we just talked about. They could have secrecy and authenticity by encrypting everything twice using an asymmetric crypto system. But like I said, that'd be expensive, especially if they did that for every message they exchanged. How about if we do this instead? At the start of communication, we'll exchange messages, but only to agree on a key, a throwaway key that we'll call a session key. We'll use an asymmetric crypto system to agree upon a symmetric key that we're going to use to cover all subsequent communication. And then once we've agreed on that, we'll stop using an asymmetric system, that more expensive crypto system, and we'll start using a cheap symmetric system. Since we covered the agreement on the key, we covered that with our asymmetric crypto system. Each of us used our key pair to generate that. No one else should be able to know the key that we agreed to. So we've picked a key that no one else should be able to eavesdrop. But then we can use a symmetric system to encrypt all messages that we communicate afterward. And since no one knows the key that we're using, they shouldn't be able to decrypt those messages. And modern secure ways of communicating over the network typically use mechanisms like this. If you're using secure sockets layer, if you're using HTTPS, then internally you're using mechanisms like this to agree to a key and then communicate using that key. So using a session key, I call that a cryptographic shortcut because it has a lot of the advantages of an asymmetric system in terms of who could eavesdrop on your communication and what they could do with that. But once you've picked a session key, it has a lot of the performance advantages of I hope I said this right, of a symmetric system, of something like AES. There's another trick that I would call a cryptographic shortcut, and that's how digital signatures are computed. The idea of a digital signature is I want to have a document and I want a person or a piece of software out there to be able to agree to that document, to demonstrate, kind of like you would with a regular signature. You sign a document to show that you agree to it, to sort of demonstrate that you've deliberately agreed to that document. I'm struggling here a little bit because this idea of stamping a document with your agreement with some kind of digital signature, we could use that for all kinds of things, not just agreeing to some kind of contract. We could have another software system that was willing to demonstrate the authenticity of a particular message using this same trick. So we'll call it a digital signature. We want a user to be able to stamp a document with a user or a system to be able to stamp a document to show that they agree with it. And if every user had a key pair, we could do this just by encrypting the document with their private key. Let's say message M was your document and you encrypted it with your private key. Well, only you should have been able to do that. Only you should know your private key. anyone else can check that you agreed to that document by decrypting it with your public key. And if you encrypted it with your private key, it should decrypt with your public key. And since only you should have been able to decrypt it that way, this would be a way of checking to make sure you agreed to that document. But this is probably a bad idea because this, like I said, would be computationally expensive. What if the document is really big? Well, encrypting with an asymmetric crypto system is expensive, but you only have to do that once. But checking to see if you agreed to that, decrypting it, we have to do that every time we might want to check your signature, and that's still going to be expensive. And if it's encrypted, your document is going to look like random garbage until we decrypt it. So it's not really a readable document until we bother to decrypt it. So even though this could give us a way of demonstrating that you agreed to a particular document, this isn't really how digital signatures work for the two reasons I just mentioned. How do they work? They use this idea of a cryptographic hash that we previously talked about. If you've got a document and you're going to digitally sign it, how that works is we'll generate a cryptographic hash, or some piece of software on your behalf will generate a cryptographic hash of that document. And then you'll take the cryptographic hash and you'll encrypt that with your private key. You're just encrypting a hash of the document. So the hash of the document is smallish compared to, well, really for however big the document might be. The cryptographic hash is fixed sized, so it should be cheap to encrypt. It's just a small thing we have to encrypt. You've encrypted it with your private key. So since only you know that private key, only you should be able to encrypt the hash that way. And then, like I said, you'll tack that little bit of random looking garbage onto the end of the document. And you can see notationally here, I'm showing the same thing I just talked about. You'll take the document M, you'll cryptographically hash it, and then you'll encrypt the result with your private key. And that's your way of signing the document. Now, what good is that? How does that work? Anyone who's going to check a digital signature knows that that's how it was generated. So they can take the document, they can hash it just like you did, because the cryptographic hash doesn't depend on knowing any key. They can decrypt your digital signature and make sure it matches the hash. So they can't take the hash and encrypt it the way you did, but they can take the signature at the end of your document and decrypt it using your public key. And if it matches the cryptographic hash of the document, you must have signed that document. Well, what's to keep someone from taking your document, taking the digital signature at the end, and just changing your document and leaving the digital signature there? Well, that's where the behavior of a cryptographic hash is important. If they tried to do that, if they tried to take your document that you signed and modify it by sticking some, changing the text or putting something else in there, and then they just copied the digital signature onto the end of the document, well, if someone was checking the signature and they did what I just said, they would take the document, run it through the same cryptographic hash. They would take the digital signature at the end and decrypt that using your public key. Then these two hashes probably wouldn't match. Why do I say probably wouldn't match? Well, this hash was generated from the original document. This one's generated from a modified document. And if a cryptographic hash is doing its job, it should be very hard for an attacker to find any other document that hashes to the same thing. So I'm going to say it's not, if a cryptographic hash is doing its job, it's not feasible for an attacker to come up with another document that hashes to exactly the same thing. So if they just took your signature and copied it to a different document, it'd be easy to catch them doing that. So this is internally how digital signatures work. They use a asymmetric crypto system, but they use it in a way so that the computational overhead of that system isn't too bad, no matter how big the document is. We only have to hash the document and then encrypt or decrypt a smallish hash of the document. That gets us mostly to the end of our material on protection and security. We talked about protection. That's, like I said at the start of today's lecture, that's mostly about mechanisms for saying what the OS should do, what domains can access what objects, and then depending on the OS to enforce that. Security often involves thinking more creatively, thinking about recognizing potential and even past attacks on a system, and developing countermeasures against those, either by how we grant access to a system, or kind of like we said in the middle, by taking advantage of technologies like encryption that provide us a bunch of different ways of reducing the effectiveness of attacks. At the start of the material on protection, I said, or sorry, on security, I said, all the protection mechanisms in the world aren't going to do you any good if an attacker can walk into a building and pick up your computer and carry it out the building or take the hard drive out of it. But that thing we said about encryption could protect against that. If you make sure all of your data on your hard drive is encrypted, then an attacker who takes that data may not be able to make any sense of it. They might still be able to launch a breach of availability if they take your computer system away or smash it with a baseball bat. Other users may not be able to access that system, but at least you've prevented a potential breach of integrity attack by making sure that the data's all, that they can't change it in a meaningful way. I said today's lecture would be short, so I'll plan, even though I was hoping we could get to some of the material on secondary storage, we'll save that for next time, and we'll stop here. I'll hang around after the lecture if there are any questions, but like I said, we only covered part of the material on security here. Be sure to watch the lecture that I posted over the weekend, since that has a lot of the encryption information that we skipped over today. Thanks for your attention. I'll see you on Wednesday.